Hello and welcome to our third writing workshop. This one is about your results and discussion sections. So this is the third and fourth major sections of your paper following your literature review and methodology. So this is where you're testing your hypotheses, so more number-centric in the results section. And the discussion section is where you discuss what happened with those hypotheses, whether they conform to your sort of predictions and what the literature review was saying, or whether something else happened, and then maybe explaining that in some way based on the quality of the methodology you used or other aspects of the study, and putting it in context in terms of generalizability and maybe external validity. So let's go through these one section at a time. So your results section, like I said, is the more number-centric section of the paper where you present your numbers, mean, standard deviation, all those descriptive statistics, as well as your tests of hypotheses. So this section is basically how the hypotheses were tested, right? So the literature review leads up to these tests. You present the analyses that you use to perform some sort of test of these, right? And then you basically just explain the results associated with that without a lot of discussion, right? So this is right up your methods, parallel to your intro and methods, I say, in that when you speak of hypothesis 1, you test hypothesis 1. You'll present hypothesis 2 next in the lit review. You test hypothesis 2 next in the results section, right? So parallel in that fashion, and that you speak to the variables and the hypotheses in relatively the same order, and that just helps with ease of reading the papers, right? So remember, this is a discussion of the results, not so much the implications, the discussion of these results. It just presents the tests, the results of those tests, whether they were significant or not, maybe some other sort of exploratory analyses, but no real discussion of what that means in regards to the larger theories or anything. So in terms of the order of this overall section, again, it follows the basic fashion that the hypotheses were presented in. Sometimes there's other stuff presented first. Sometimes means, standard deviations, other indices of variance are mentioned first, relative to maybe the scales, the variables that you're studying and how those relate to sort of norms potentially. You also may present a manipulation check to show whether there was internal validity, whether the manipulation worked and was successful, and things like scale quality. But most of this goes in the outside of means, most of these scale reliabilities, any sort of factor analysis, item stuff, example items, all of that goes in your method section, remember. So very little actually in terms of the scales is presented in the results section, just the overall results of tests between sort of the scale score levels of those scales, right? Anyways, if there's some sort of nominal data like males versus females, you may see figures or tables presenting data for each set, whether it's age categories or gender, right? And then oftentimes correlations, like a correlation matrix, is the next thing to present it. I recommend a matrix of all your correlations in your final papers as that major table you'll need. And then next will come the inferential statistics, any tests of those hypotheses. And this sounds relatively like the example here, where you say something like, our first hypothesis predicted higher levels of emotional exhaustion would be related to lower levels of job performance, consistent with prediction, right, or inconsistent with prediction if it was non-significant. Say the type of analysis that was done, here a correlational analysis, and that it revealed in this case some sort of relationship, in this case higher scores on emotional exhaustion were related to lower scores on the performance measure, which was performance evaluations in this case. If you remember in one of the labs, we say them conceptually, the hypotheses, and in more operational terms. And this is where those operational definitions really help you, and operational sort of phrasings of your hypotheses, because you'll really want to say it like that in the results section. And then, of course, present the actual statistics associated with that. And the appendix of your textbook and the AP manual will help a lot with this, giving examples of how you present means and standard deviations, and F statistics for ANOVA type tests, and R's and P's or B's and P's for regression analyses. If the study is not quantitative, right, the qualitative results may sound slightly different, right? The type of study you're doing matters in terms of how you discuss those results. So a qualitative study might sound something like the example there, speaking more towards the themes of responses or something like that. And this one serves as a sort of a quote. Individuals in the treatment group reported emotions such as despair and helplessness followed a more depressed theme from the coding, right? So you could sort of mimic phraseology like that to discuss sort of overall themes you see in maybe qualitative response options that you gave. Quantitatively, of course, it sounds a little bit more like the very first example where you're saying some sort of mean differences or some sort of relationship in the operational terms, of course, and then offering the statistics to back that up. What you get from the SPSS or other statistical program, the output there. So I want you to hopefully pause this. If we were in person, I'd have you take out a piece of paper and write out what you think would be a sentence, maybe a couple sentences from your results section. Part of this is really just your hypothesis, remember, so try to recall one of your hypotheses and then say the test that you would do, and then what would happen, let's say if it was consistent with hypotheses or predictions, right? So restate that, say how you would test it, and then say the result. And that's really what you do in almost every test of your hypothesis in the results section. Some other sort of tips for the results section. Remember that large sets of numbers you'll see are often tabled or organized in some other sort of mass format, especially if you're looking at sort of group comparisons, like those age categories or genders like I mentioned. And remember that tables should give all the relevant information. So if there's sample size important, sometimes you'll see notes at the bottom that says that sample size may differ based on certain groups or something. Make sure that significance are labeled if appropriate, things like that. So highlight anything. Something that's often highlighted in correlation matrices is the reliabilities. Sometimes those will be offered in the diagonal of the table. That when the SPSS printout comes out, it'll be dashes or ones. If you put the reliabilities there, it's sort of a space saver, and that's often a note in the bottom there. And make sure for any table or figure you turn in for this class that it's, of course, professionally prepared through Excel or PowerPoint or some other sort of professional program. This is an example table you might see. You see in the diagonal those reliabilities that I mentioned, and of course the note at the bottom explaining that those internal consistency estimates are there in the format of coefficient alpha. But that's how it was calculated, I should say, which is a type of reliability estimate. And then of course the correlations in there, and you'll see that there's a notation at the bottom of which correlations are significant based on how large they are. That's one way of doing it. Another way you'll see it is asterisks, of course, to save space. Some other general tips. Remember, statistic capitalization is important. So small t's are different than big t's. Same with a lot of the other letters like big R's and little r's. They mean different things. But any statistics like that should be in italics. Not the numbers, just the letters associated with them, right? Some other things, APA style, you spell out numbers less than 10, that's APA style, but it's related to the results section, of course. And of course, remember to explain the analyses utilized, right? And the result, but not the implications, right? So say whether it's ANOVA, correlation, t-test, whatever you did, and whether it's significant or not, and give those statistical values, but don't try to explain it in any large fashion. Just say whether it's sort of consistent or not with sort of the idea. And of course, don't include stuff that's not meaningful. If you're not testing anything related to age or gender, there shouldn't necessarily be a table or a pie chart or something displaying that information, right? The next major section is your discussion, right? And this is the final section before your references, right? And appendices or anything like that. It really first summarizes what happens or what was supposed to happen, right? In terms of your theories, your tests and results. And what actually did happen, and then why that may or may not have gone the way you planned, right? So this includes things like limitations and strengths of your study, as well as future directions for researchers to maybe look to the next step or fix what maybe went wrong, as well as maybe those practitioners in the field, a la our last lecture. So of course this is a summary of the project, like I said, in addition to the implications and future directions, which you maybe were holding yourself back from discussing in that results section, right? Shouldn't repeat the results word for word. Shouldn't have many numbers in here. Should really summarize and highlight what was going on. So look to those key significances or where it failed to reach significance and you anticipated that it would have. If there's any exploratory sorts of results, those are fun to see. Some of the most exciting or interesting results in studies are actually the unplanned stuff, which then they have to point researchers to maybe look further into since they didn't hypothesize that necessarily. Okay, so in terms of the order of your discussion section, right, first, like I said, there's the summary, right, of the overall study. The purpose of the current investigation was blah, 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 right? This is why I say for most researchers to look to this discussion section and specifically this first paragraph or two to really get a good idea of what happened in the study, then maybe go back and read that lit review in depth or go back and look at that methodology to see how they tested those results. Or predictions, I should say. The discussion section also has, like I said, these strengths and limitations. So what did you do well? Did you have good reliability? Did your coders have inter-rater agreement? Things like that are often mentioned here. Limitations, of course, might be low reliability, low agreement, as well as sample size, lack of diversity in any of your categories. Like if you have only young people, that's something that y'all will have a lack of diversity in, and you can mention that as a limitation, as well as probably small sample size, right? And the implications, of course, for practice and future directions for research are the two sections where you point to practitioners, how they should utilize this information, and of course researchers, how they should take that next step if they were going from your study right back into the lab and starting a new study. What would be the next step for them, right? And then usually there's some sort of conclusion section offering some sort of take-home message. What is the overall lessons learned from this study? Take it back maybe to the broadest level again in terms of the societal or sort of largest picture that you can take, and sort of what your findings mean in terms of that overall theory or overall sort of idea that was presented in the earliest stages of that lit review. So in terms of those strengths, how did your study do better than others? Did you manipulate where people didn't? Did you have more statistical power by using maybe better scales? What happened in your study? Did you use different analyses? These are things that y'all may not know as new researchers, but you can look to other studies that you've gathered and see some of the things that they say that might be more specific to the types of research you're doing. That might be something that's very strong about your study. There's more things that are strong about your study than most realize, but think on this, and if you make yourself do a paragraph about it, you'll find some strengths, right? So list some of those down if you can. Feel free to pause this and think through some of the things like diversity. Most of your samples will have a good degree of ethnic diversity, which is what a lot of studies lack. You may have limitations in terms of age, but you might also have a strong group of, let's say, people with experience in your field. So if it's education, 100% of the sample was currently involved in education, right? That could be a strength. Limitations, of course, are those aspects, that sort of maybe hindered you or sort of hurt you in getting your statistical significance. So this could be internal, external validity related. In terms of internal validity, maybe the reliability, maybe the manipulation check showed poor sort of performance. This could result in low power. We always talk about power in studies, the ability to find significance if it exists. You'll see other studies mention that. I don't expect you all to necessarily go into the power. But if you know that you had bad reliability, your manipulation didn't work, you can probably assume that you had a limited chance of finding a significant result, right? If nothing else, your sample size is low. So poor results, in terms of maybe variability as well as lack of significance, and things like unrepresentative sample is often something to discuss, but y'all actually have a pretty good ethnic diversity. Usually what you're lacking is sort of age diversity, or maybe diversity in terms of type of schooling, or things like that. So think of some of those limitations for your study. These could be actually sort of part and parcel of what their strengths. So something that's a strength, like high reliability, could actually be sort of something future researchers could use. They could look to those scales. Same with limitations. If you have a bad manipulation or low manipulation check sort of validity, then you could tell future researchers to look to better manipulations for that type of study. So sort of that reflective sort of back and forth is something to consider if you have a hard time thinking of any limitations. In terms of future directions for research, right, not practice in this case, but what others should do maybe to try and find significance if you didn't, or what next steps they should do, right? So something to consider is, did your results differ from previous studies? Why or why not? Is this something that's maybe inherent in your sample, or something like a third variable that could be affecting this? Sometimes exploratory analyses reveal something interesting like gender differences that could be explored by future researchers, so that's something you could point to. A lot of times, if it's not predicted in advance, researchers like you to research that from the start again, to have that a priori hypothesis. So that's something another researcher could do. And so any sort of future next step is something to suggest here. And of course, look back to these research studies that you've gathered and see what they're suggesting for future researchers. They'll give you some hints of the types of stuff to say. Of course, don't say it in the same way, that'd be plagiarism, right? But you can say something similar. So think of some of those future directions. Did you not manipulate a variable where you wanted to? Did your scale reliability show a low score? That means maybe you should use different measures in the future. Maybe it should be manipulated, or maybe there's different groups of people that you should be looking at. Think about what future researchers should be doing. The last sort of section of this is the future directions for practice, right, or the flip side of this. We shall have the conclusion after this, but what should practitioners take away from this? Why should they care about this? How can it affect their jobs or what they do and apply in terms of their psychology? Is there something people in the field should be doing different, let's say? So if your study finds a significant result for something, let's say a certain type of trauma or whatever, should researchers be looking at this trauma differently? And on the flip side of that, are there reasons people should not be interested in your findings? Are there caveats or limitations? We say stuff like boundary conditions or, generalizability problems. If you only have, let's say, a young Caucasian sample, then, maybe you should say this may not work with older people of color, let's say. So you have to sort of explain that sometimes and think about the lecture related to the Lillian field, sort of spelling that out and communicating where your results might matter and where they might not, right, or who these results might not apply to. Anyways, and then, finally, does your research, does your findings, right, do they speak to the lives of everyday people, right? Are there any sort of changes that could be made, not just within sort of therapeutic settings or work settings, but think about the sort of practical implications of this for individuals, and that may help you think of some sort of future directions for people applying these things, these findings. So think of some of these future directions if possible, related to practice. So who should care about this? Why? What sorts of daily tasks of individuals could be affected or changed based on the results? Not all of these questions, of course, apply to every study, but hopefully that'll spur some sort of thinking for you. And finally, at the end of this sort of section, or the overall discussion section, you should have some sort of wrap-up, some sort of conclusion, right? So restating the findings is an easy way to start this, but then very quickly what you want to do is broaden the scope, right? Take this back to the larger sort of picture, right, that you discussed. So I had the pyramid here on campus as an image of sort of starting very specific, right, that point being your results, but then broadening it out like the base of that pyramid. When you start your lit review, the classic sort of analogy is to start very broad, like an upside-down triangle, and then get very specific with your hypotheses. So the conclusion and the discussion as a whole sort of does this in the opposite direction, right? You start off very specific with your summary of the research study at the beginning of the discussion, and you can emulate that at the conclusion. But then at the very broadest level is where you should end it, right? So those statements about the overall sort of implications of these results should be some of the last lines of the overall sort of paper, right? Sort of bringing it back to sort of that broad level or that theoretical level. Hopefully that makes sense. Some general tips overall for this. Remember, for the discussion section, you shouldn't be presenting any new data to speak of. You don't want to bring in a whole lot of new literature unless there's some sort of interesting or exploratory finding that you want to try to explain. You might be able to bring in a new site or two related to that, but most of the time you stick to the stuff that you already talked about in your lit review. So that's good news, right? You don't have to bring in new stuff, so no new citations, no new data. And be sure, like I said, to point to not just future directions, but also the implications, right? What does this mean for researchers and practitioners out there, right? And when you're doing that, be specific. If you're talking about doing a manipulation, describe that manipulation. A lot of times new writers don't know what to write about. And if you read studies, a lot of times they're waxing sort of prophetic or intellectual about the topic. You can do the same thing. You can sort of discuss what might be a good manipulation, or what might be a good way to study this, or what might be a good population to look into in the future. So you can sort of discuss that in a little bit more conversational terms than maybe the lit review. Remember, the overall outline of this should look something like this, right? So you're going through your tests, any exploratory hypotheses, and then going through your discussion, summarizing all of that, stating your strengths and limitations, and then having hopefully sections for each your implications for research and implications for practice. If you have headers and subheaders related to all of these things, you're probably in really good shape, right? Some final thoughts on this. I know a research study can be a jumble by the end, and it seems like you've started with these, lit reviews, you've sort of consolidated that into a project, and now you have a lot of different methodologies and numbers flowing in. But remember, this all is sort of about a finding that you're trying to predict, right? So don't let all the jumble, all the paperwork and all of the citations you're trying to gather and the data you're trying to analyze let you lose the forest for the trees. All of this is really building up a theory towards a hypothesis, showing and explaining what you did methodologically, going through the tests, and then discussing how that test really either showed what you expected or didn't, and why in each case, and why it matters, right? So hopefully you can find a little bit of sort of clarity through the organization of the entire paper and see sort of the overall goal again of this endeavor. Hopefully this was a fun research project for you, and if not, research is sometimes challenging, so that's realistic too, right? But I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.